It's a day that the world's been looking forward to for a while now. The leaders of the United States and North Korea finally met on the Sentosa Island in Singapore. The North Korean leader Kim Jong-un was the first to arrive at the luxury Capella hotel for the summit. Now, within minutes of his arrival, the US President Donald Trump showed up as well with his motorcade to meet with the leaders of the Korean nation. These visuals are of course, when Chairman Kim arrived at the summit venue, followed shortly by President Donald Trump. Now, both men, of course, have made history in this meeting even taking place. Kim Jong-un and President Trump, the first representatives of their nations to sit across from one another in 70 long years. This, of course, was earlier this morning at around 9 a.m. local time in Singapore when President Donald Trump arrived at the Capella Hotel on Sentosa Island. He was preceded there by the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. As I was mentioning, the two of them have already made history by becoming the first sitting US and North Korean leaders respectively to meet and shake hands. They're seeking to end a tense, decades-old nuclear standoff. The two men strode toward one another and shared a handshake with the flags of both their countries in the backdrop before they sat down for a half an hour of a one-on-one meeting and a half day of meetings overall with ramifications for the entire world. Now, ahead of the meeting, the American president took to Twitter to say, quote, "The fact that I'm having a meeting is a major loss for the US, say the haters and losers. We have our hostages, testing, research, and all missile launches have stopped. And these pundits who have called me wrong from the beginning have nothing else they can say. We will be fine," end quote. The two leaders struck an optimistic note before the meeting as well. Listen in.
I feel really great. We're going to have a great discussion, and I think tremendous success. We'll be tremendously successful. And it's my honor, and we will have a terrific relationship, I have no doubt.
Well, it was not easy to get here.
우리한테는 우리 발목을 잡는 그 과거가 있고 또 그릇된 분명과 발행들이 우리 때로는 우리 눈과 귀를 가리고 있었는데 우리 모든 것을 이겨내고 이 자리까지 왔습니다.
The past worked as fetters on our limbs, and the old prejudices and practices worked as obstacles on our way forward, but we overcame all of them and we are here today.
That's true.
All right, let's continue our conversation with our guests. Joining me in the studio is Ambassador Arun Kumar Singh. With us from New Delhi is Ambassador Vishnu Prakash. Joining us from the United States is Professor Stephen Golub. And from Sentosa Island, where it's beginning to get hot and humid, is our very own Associate Editor Ramesh Ramachandran. I'll go across to him first. Ramesh, you've of course been tracking this story from the get-go. You were in along the DMZ when that... All right, I'm being told we're trying to re-establish connect with Ramesh Ramachandran. Let me go back to Ambassador Singh, who's with me in the studio on that note. Ambassador Singh, at the center of all of this is that word denuclearization. And I think we've stressed enough already that it means different things to different people over here. But for a country like China, I want to talk a little bit more about, President Xi Jinping. Kim Jong-un went to meet him twice. One was a meeting that the United States was aware of. The second one was one that they were not aware of. Where exactly does China figure in all of this? And do you think that it's fair to say that they're jittery about this meeting going on between President Trump and Kim Jong-un?
China would certainly not want developments to take place in a direction that is a challenge to its own interests and concerns. And it has been pointed out repeatedly that one thing that China would certainly not want is any kind of unification of the Korean Peninsula in a way that is a challenge to China's interests. And so that they would watch that process very, very closely. And although North Korea is heavily dependent on China, there are frictions and tensions in the China-North Korea relationship, and therefore they would also want to make sure that whatever evolves between North Korea and the US is something that they are fully aware of and comfortable with. At the same time, they would want a reduction in the hostility between North Korea and the US so that they can pursue a more normal trade and economic interaction with North Korea and leading to a more normalized regime in that country. Because the kind of regime that functions there is also enabled by the hostile environment that it perceives and projects around itself. So I think that would be China's concerns. Ideally, China itself, from its own point of view, would not want a nuclear North Korea. But as of now, that's an established fact.
Right.
Now, Ramesh had also referred to whether earlier any country with nuclear capacity had gone back on that. And he made a very valid point. Although in some cases, countries with had capacity have gone back, but not of the same level as North Korea. South Africa, under the apartheid regime, was believed to have developed some capacity and then dismantled it once the apartheid regime moved away. And a couple of countries in Latin America were believed to be developing that capacity and then went back from that as the US pushed them as it wanted to perpetuate the nuclear non-proliferation treaty.
Right.
Similarly, some of the countries that are countries today but were part of the former Soviet Union had the capacities for nuclear weapons capability, and they dismantled that once they became independent countries after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So there have been historical precedents of that kind of a process, but of course not of a country like North Korea with the level that it has displayed.
Sure.
So we have to see, what does denuclearization mean? Is it a limit on capacity, some rollback, or a full dismantling, which is very unlikely, which is what some of the more hardline hawkish elements in the US would want.
Right.
But then the question would be that if it is only a question of limits, then what is the impact on the global non-proliferation regime?
Sure.
How are the other countries, let's say a country like Iran?
And I suppose that's why it's fair to say that this meeting does have implications for the entire globe, I mean the region of course, but looking at the entire picture, it does have a domino effect that could take place. Professor Golub, going back to the ambassador's assessment of China's, a dog in this fight, if you will, does it sound a bit like wanting to, have your cake and eat it too? You want peace, you want, good relations to exist, but at the same time you don't want to lose your foot in the door, because for a long time China has been sort of the go-to when it comes to negotiating or speaking even with North Korea.
That's a good question. I think China does have maybe some mixed motivations here. Maybe in the immediate aftermath of some kind of an agreement or process that comes out of today's meeting, North Korea may be a little bit closer to the U.S., but still, I think China does not want a war on its doorstep. It does not want a collapsing North Korean regime on its doorstep. I think the ambassador is absolutely right that even though it's North Korea's closest ally in many respects, and certainly its closest trading partner, there are definitely tensions between those two regimes. So there are mixed motivations there. But I think China above all does not want to see a war result from the collapse of negotiations or the collapse of a process down the line. And in that sense, it's certainly maybe wary of what's going on now, but is wary in the sense of wanting to remain a player in the game, and wanting at the same time that the Korean Peninsula remains peaceful.
Okay, I suppose we don't have that kind of a question mark over what South Korea wants from all of this. Ambassador Prakash, Moon Jae-in, the South Korean president, has been very clear about his entire perspective when it comes to this meeting taking place and wanting peace to be brokered on the Korean Peninsula. But is that a sentiment that is enjoyed by many South Koreans? Does he speak for his people when he says he wants peace to exist and for this war to officially be called off?
Very much so, 100%. In fact, a survey was done soon after the 27th April third Inter-Korean Summit at Panmunjom, and 80% of the South Koreans welcomed it. And 80% of the South Koreans had a favorable rating view of Kim Jong-un, which was unprecedented. And interestingly, 77% of South Koreans had a favorable view of their own president. South Korea knows that if hostilities break out, there will be death and destruction at a scale that few can imagine. Seoul is just 56 kilometers from the DMZ, and South Korea is very, very keen on normalized relationship with North Korea. And I must say that President Moon Jae-in has an impeccable record as a person who has always been a votary of peace and dialogue and normalization of relationship with North Korea. It is noteworthy that yesterday President Trump called Moon Jae-in again. Moon Jae-in has been playing a quiet role, nudging here, encouraging there, clearing the air when things were spinning out of control. And he is one person who has never pushed North Korea to denuclearize rapidly or insisted on reunification. But he has always been an advocate, a realistic advocate of a step-by-step approach of normalization with North Korea. And that is what is a viable proposition. And I think that what we are seeing now is a move in that direction.
Okay, and I suppose he filled the gap, he filled a void that was left behind following, massive corruption allegations against his predecessor. So Moon Jae-in, of course, emerging as the blue-eyed boy of all of this. Ramesh Ramachandran back with us from Sentosa Island. Ramesh, I'm trying to figure out what, people on the ground feel about this meeting. You've been interacting with a number of people in Singapore. What has been their assessment overall of the choice of venue, of course, and the fact that these two men, so diametrically opposed for such a long time, have chosen to put that aside and meet, even if it is just for the cameras?
Absolutely, Aisha. The choice of the summit venue is interesting and significant. Remember, Singapore has a non-resident ambassador in Pyongyang. The ambassador is based out of Beijing, but they have a representation in Pyongyang. Singapore is also a very safe location. Security is up to the expectations of the two principals, the two leaders involved, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. So clearly, it is a venue which is acceptable to both sides. The fact remains that another dimension of this summit venue is the fact that the media is very controlled, very tight here. And this has generated conflicting opinions about Singaporeans themselves and the world media converging upon Singapore. They say Singapore needs to have more press freedoms, allow diversity of opinions, but that is something which Singapore is steadfastly against and has stood resolutely against introducing in the city-state. So that's one area, one dimension which has not been explored yet by the visiting media here. There's a lot of murmurs of discontent in Singapore about the media freedom which are absent here, and they expect the government to be a little more liberal, a little more forthright going forward. But that is still a long shot. At the moment, as things stand, media is tightly controlled, and one can see the kind of reportage in the Singaporean media to get a sense what actually is going on behind the scenes. That said, Singapore is keenly invested in the peace process. They expect a favorable outcome for the Trump-Kim summit, at least a roadmap to pave the way for future talks, future discussions between the respective diplomats from the US and North Korea. Singapore, by the way, had very close ties with North Korea, still has close ties with North Korea, but until recently, North Koreans could visit Singapore without a sort of visa beforehand. An e-visa and visa-free entry was allowed for medical treatment and so on. So that has been curtailed, but still they have very reasonably good ties with between themselves. So Singapore, by all factors, is a sensible, a reasonable choice, acceptable to both North Korea and the US. But that said, people on the streets have a differing outcome or different take on the outcome of the summit. Some expect these two unpredictable politicians to not achieve much in one meeting. Others say this could be a harbinger of hope, at least expect progress going forward, if not immediately.
All right, so differing opinions, but overall, Ambassador Singh, it seems that people are looking at this meeting as the first step towards something more. Ramesh bringing up, of course, the fact that Singapore was an interesting and strategic choice because of the relationship it has between with both the United States and North Korea. India too, interestingly enough, is one of those countries that maintains a relationship with both sides. India also refused to be drawn into the controversy over shutting down an embassy, for instance, in North Korea. So we've also maintained our position on all of this, saying that we're involved, but not that much.
So Singapore, obviously, as Ramesh mentioned, is an interesting choice, because when they would have been considering where to hold this meeting, one option would have been to do it at the demilitarized zone.
Yes.
But that would have drawn too much attention to the conflict. And it was also the venue of the meeting between North Korea and South Korea. Therefore, President Trump going there would not have added a new dimension. They couldn't have done the meeting in China, because that would have shown the strengthened role of China in any kind of process that North Korea leads. And for the same reason, it couldn't have been in the eastern coast of Russia, because of the difficulties in the US-Russia relationship. Certainly could have been in Japan, because North Korea has a very difficult relationship with Japan. So if you start looking at that, then clearly it had to be in the Southeast Asian region. And in the Southeast Asian region, Singapore is the globalized city-state. And it has very strong relationship with the United States, with the West, and therefore perhaps it emerged as an obvious choice. And again, from India's point of view, of course, we have very strong relations with the US. We have maintained continuing relationship with North Korea, also part because we've attempted to maintain relations with all countries in the world as much as we can given our capacity, but also we've been wanting to have a relationship with a government that has had a clandestine linkage with Pakistan.
Yes.
In terms of nuclear and missile proliferation. So it was important for us to keep that link there and watch that process, and not also allow that to go completely in a certain direction that would be adversarial to our interests. So that was, for example, the reason where, as you referred, when the US was pushing hard for countries to cut down on their diplomatic relations with North Korea, India had said that it would be useful for India to maintain that relationship. And again, with Singapore, as you know, as the venue, India has a very strong relationship with Singapore. When we did our Act East and Look East policies, Singapore was in the lead in terms of sort of facilitating catalyzing India's integration with countries in ASEAN. So that's important. And today you have almost 300 flights a week from Singapore to India, reflecting the very strong linkage.
Right, and there's a huge Indian community. Our own Prime Minister was there a short while back. The first time an Indian Prime Minister also made the keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue. So yes, of course, that connection, very important to note. Professor Golub, I want to come back to you also on that note to just talk a little bit more about the perception of the United States President vis-a-vis this meeting after what took place in Quebec, Canada. The fact that it was being referred to as the G6+1, the fact that President Trump talked about the readmission of Russia into the G7, and that photo that went viral of Angela Merkel sort of hands on desk, looking down or bearing down on President Trump, and him sitting there in trademark crossed arm style. What has that image and the fact that this meeting is taking place right after done for President Trump and the perception perhaps of him in the United States?
Well, in terms of President Trump himself, it weakened his negotiating position. It made it even less likely that he could walk away from this without declaring it an absolute success, because he'd already had a very antagonistic meeting. And as the ambassador had noted, had broken an agreement almost immediately that he'd made with the other members of the G7. So 2 disastrous meetings in a row would have been very bad for him, and especially bad for a president who cares above all not about foreign policy, but about perception, about how he comes across, especially to the U.S. public. So whatever comes of this, I guess it's still conceivable that there'll be a parting of ways, but it now seems very likely that he'll declare this was a tremendous success. that it started a process. That's all well and good, but you have to bear in mind, get back to the point that I made earlier, this is not a president like any previous U.S. president, or for that matter, like almost any other major world leader. His knowledge of and interest in foreign affairs, his ability to even focus, to get briefings on foreign affairs is extremely limited. He really rejects briefings on these matters, hasn't prepared well for this summit at all. But as long as he can walk away from this saying that we began a process, we reached an agreement about a process, just even if there's no substance there, that's all he cares about. And that should be a source of concern for all of us going forward.
Okay, and I think what we can all agree on before we close this particular broadcast is that there has been no president like Donald Trump before. He has made the last year and a half rather interesting for most of us, at least in the media. We'll have to leave it at that for now, gentlemen. I'll thank all of you, Ramesh Ramachandran in Sentosa, of course, Professor Golub, Ambassadors Vishnu Prakash and Arun Kumar Singh. Thank you all for making time to speak with us this morning. But for our viewers, a quick reminder, our coverage of the historic Trump-Kim summit continues on the other side of this short break. I'm taking a quick breather. Amitabh Revi joins you on the other side.